Strangers, get out of our house. A few days after Richard passed away, suddenly 9 of his relatives barged into our house. They claimed the house was theirs and that I, an outsider, should leave. However, upon hearing this, I burst into laughter. Unaware of the situation, they stared at me suspiciously and pressed me for an explanation. Don't you all know? I revealed a wish Richard had entrusted to me, which left his relatives pale-faced. Shocked by the truth, they nearly collapsed. My name is Hilary Ford. I work in the kitchen of a restaurant, aged 52. Hilary, can you work overtime today? Hey, manager. Hilary said she couldn't do overtime. That's right. She has to visit her husband in the hospital. So we said we would cover for her until he's discharged. Ah. That's right. Sorry, Hilary, you can leave on time today. Our restaurant is a famous Chinese restaurant in town. It's cheap and delicious, yet voluminous, which is why there's a queue every day. I used to happily work overtime. But since my husband Richard was diagnosed with cancer and is now hospitalized, I have been leaving on time. He is 54 years old, 2 years older than me. We've been married for 30 years. But this is the first time he's faced such a serious illness. Although we discovered the cancer during a medical checkup, it had already metastasized, and his condition has rapidly deteriorated since. It's pathetic. Since I usually just stayed at home and worked, I don't have much physical strength. He worked from home as an interior coordinator, freelancing, and managed all his work on a single computer. Thanks to this, he mostly took care of the household chores, and I was free to work from morning till night. However, since he fell ill, I've had to ask my workplace for a shift change. I start early in the morning and leave during the busiest hours to take care of him. That's how I've come to rely on everyone's help. Everyone, I'm sorry for always causing trouble. What are you saying? If you look so gloomy, your husband will feel uneasy when you visit. That's right. Keep smiling and take good care of him. If things get tough, the manager can handle both the hall and the kitchen. Hey, what do you think I am? My cheerful colleagues laughed. When I asked them for help, none of them showed a displeased face and accepted it. In fact, they even suggested I leave early. The manager adjusted the shift, despite the loss of money, to my current working hours. I am truly grateful to work in such a wonderful place. Once things settle down, I'll definitely repay their kindness. With these thoughts, I thanked everyone, punched out my time card, quickly got ready, and rushed to the hospital. Ah, Mrs. Ford. The doctor just arrived and is talking with your husband. When I arrived at the hospital, a nurse kindly informed me. Upon hearing her words, I hurried to the room where Richard and the doctor were talking. Your wife is here too. Oh, you're done with work? Thanks for your hard work. Richard is 2 years older than me. People often mistook me as the older one due to his youthful face. But since his cancer diagnosis, he seems to have aged rapidly. Now, he looks his age, perhaps even older. His gaunt face has lost its vitality, and his smile is feeble. I won't lose to the disease, he had said cheerfully at first. But the body is honest. Contrary to his words, he is weakening day by day. We were just discussing the progression of his illness. My husband's condition is. Doctor, I'll explain the rest myself. I tried to hear more from the doctor, but Richard interrupted, giving me a bad feeling. The doctor seemed to sense something as well and quietly left the room after nodding. Hey, Hillary, how long have we been together since we got married? Suddenly, Richard muttered while looking out the window. More than his condition, I was perplexed but answered his question. 30 years. 30 years. It felt long, but looking back, it went by in a blink of an eye. Stop it. It sounds like the end is near. Half a year. As Richard reminisced, he spoke as if he had come to terms with the end of his life, prompting me to hastily stop his remarks. However, he spoke over my words and looked away. We've got about half a year left. Probably less. I know my own body best. Richard smiled faintly, his face downturned. The moment I heard his words, my worst fears were confirmed, and tears welled up in my eyes. Sorry, I've made you sad. I promised when we got married I'd never make you feel sad. Noticing my tears, Richard raised his head, smiled troublingly, and gently wiped away my tears with his finger. Tears were also welling up in his eyes. And seeing that, I cried even harder. I began to sob, unable to hold back my tears. When I'm gone, I have to apologize to your parents. I made their daughter cry, sorry. Stop it. If he were gone, the rest of my life would be lonely. We had laughed and talked about being together when our time came. As if he had given up on living, Richard spoke such sad words, and I openly showed my anger. It sounds like it's already decided. Don't say such sad things, Hillary. It's not definitely decided yet. Medicine has advanced. If we look for a different hospital, maybe. I'm going to be gone. Unable to accept reality, I raised my voice. Richard gently held my hand and continued his words as if to console me. I'll be gone soon. No. I absolutely don't want that. I want to take care of what needs to be done before I'm gone. I want to spend every last moment with you. Saying this, Richard shared his plans for the future. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in a hospital. I want to go back home with you. And I know you have work, Hillary, but could you take a few days off? I want to go on that trip we planned. I want to fulfill every wish you've had, so please. Richard pleaded. His words and demeanor hammered home the reality. That this was no dream, it was all too real. I was painfully aware that there was no more hope. Respecting his wishes, I held back tears and informed the doctor about our decision. The doctor respected our wishes and immediately began the discharge process, arranging for tests to ensure he could leave the hospital by tomorrow. Thus, Richard's final hospital stay was decided. Richard, I've come to visit. Hi. How are you feeling? About ready to kick the bucket, huh? Hillary, you're here too. I thought it was just Richard. Since there was time until dinner, I stayed in the hospital room to be with him as long as possible. Suddenly, Richard's mother, his brother Greg, and Greg's wife Jenny arrived to visit. It's been a while, you all. Greg, Richard's brother, is 55 and works in construction. But he has a terrible habit of slacking off and has no title at his age. Merely coasting along at work. His wife, Jenny, is 34 and beautiful. But her harsh facial expressions and terrible language, especially towards me, are striking. She seems to despise me. Their mother is 74 but looks younger and is physically fit. However, her nasty personality is clear, and she is miserly with money. She dotes on Greg and dismisses Richard. I despise Richard's family. Greg, as usual, makes insensitive jokes, and Jenny probably hates me. From the moment we met, she has treated me as an enemy, dropping snide remarks whenever she could. The mother-in-law treats Richard and me as if we are not human, constantly irritating us. She sees him as a cash cow. Every time we meet, it's always about money. Greg has a large family, doesn't he? Since you two don't have children and both earn, you must have some extra money, right? Can you spare some? This kind of pleading had become the norm. Greg's family, including his mother, is a family of 9. His previous wife ran away, leaving him with 4 stepchildren, and he remarried Jenny, who had 2 children with him, leading to a life of poverty. They couldn't make ends meet on their earnings alone and started begging us for money. What do you all want with so many of you here? What's with that tone? Your own mother comes to visit, and that's how you greet her? That's right, Richard. Value your mother. She's been lonely since your father passed away. The in-laws' attitude worsened after the father-in-law passed away. He was a strict and sensible man. While he was alive, the mother-in-law did not behave this way. The family was harmonious. However, after his death from old age, she changed completely, as if freed from a shackle. She had been considerate towards us only because of the father-in-law's wishes. Without him, she treated me as an intruder. Richard, too, became merely a source of money for her. Greg had been disowned during the father's lifetime due to eloping with his previous wife. But the disownment was lifted after the father's death, and he returned home with Jenny as his new wife. Even though this town puts a lot of effort into supporting child-rearing, raising 6 children is simply beyond ordinary financial means. Richard always shook his head at such naive thinking. It's been tough making ends meet this month. Could you help us out a bit? What? Stop it. How can you say such foolish things at a time like this? Stay out of this, outsider. This is a family matter. That's how it is. Furious at their audacity, I raised my voice in anger, but Greg dismissed me. And Jenny laughed mockingly at me, shooing me away as if I were a dog. I'm sorry, but we can't spare any money. Oh. That's inconvenient. I thought you'd have some money since I came all this way. Sigh. Really, what a useless son. His mother muttered under her breath, barely audible to Richard. The 3 of them were behaving in a way that stretched the limits of decency. So, how is he doing? The cancer progression, discharge plans? Clearly, she wasn't asking out of concern. It was typical of her greedy nature. Probably scheming for some financial benefit. He has about 6 months left. He'll be discharged tomorrow to spend his remaining time at home. Seriously? At that moment, their eyes gleamed, not with shock, but with a gleeful expression that was hard to believe. The sight of their joy at such news was nauseating. Then, I'll come to pick him up when he's discharged. You'll need a car, right? That won't be necessary. Despite Richard maintaining his composure, his mother and the others kept pushing their limits. Unable to tolerate their behavior any longer, I forcibly pushed the 3 of them out of the room. Hey, what are you doing? Please leave. I will handle everything on the day of his discharge. So there is no need for you to come. Don't ever show your face again. What? Hey, are you kidding? I dismissed any further complaints from them, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I quickly explained the situation to the hospital staff, asked the nurse to restrict visits to anyone but me, and ensured that the in-laws could not meet Richard. Sorry, Hillary. I've caused you trouble. Why don't you stand up to them? They're mocking you, treating you like a cash cow? It was frustrating. Why should such rotten people live comfortably, while someone as good as Richard has to disappear? It might be misdirected anger, but I couldn't bear it. I still deeply love Richard and couldn't accept the reality of him being gone. I didn't want to stress myself arguing back. But seeing you speak up clearly for me made me happy. That's why I have a favor to ask of you. A favor? Then, Richard entrusted me with a task. The content was so shocking that I couldn't hide my surprise. However, he was dead serious, looking earnestly at me and emphasizing his request. It's my first and last favor, so please. Understood. Thus, I took charge of something from Richard and returned home that day. Before his relatives could arrive the next day, I hurriedly discharged Richard from the hospital. Even though we were home, I feared his relatives might show up at any moment. Wanting to keep Richard away from them, I changed one of his wishes. Instead of staying at our house, I asked an acquaintance for a favor, and we temporarily moved into a villa they owned. Being away from home was a bit sad, but I don't care where I am as long as you're with me, Richard said with a bashful smile, making me blush a bit too. After that, I explained the situation to my workplace and took a long leave of absence. I wanted to be by Richard's side until the last moments of his life. With the help of friends, Richard was able to spend his remaining time peacefully until he passed away quietly in his bed 6 months later. At the funeral, I reunited with his relatives after a long time. I braced myself for their comments, but instead of showing sorrow, they simply smirked and stared at me with eerie smiles. The creepiness of their grins sent chills down my spine. What did that smile mean? I was soon to find out. After the funeral, when I was back home sorting through Richard's belongings, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I was greeted by his mother and Greg, both carrying an excessive amount of luggage. We finally found you. Got a call from a neighbor saying you're back. What's with all this luggage? His mother complained as she tried to barge inside. But I blocked her way at the entrance, and Greg glared at me annoyingly. What are you doing? Move, you're in the way. I won't move. What's with this luggage? And why have you brought the kids too? Behind Greg, his entire family was present. I was puzzled by the situation, but showing confusion would play into their hands. They must have schemed something and come to our house. I decided to confront them firmly. Laughing mockingly, his mother uttered an unbelievable statement. From today, this house is ours. Others, get out of our house. I was stunned by her words. Unbelievably, his relatives, all 9 of them, had decided to take over our house on their own. Lost for words at their audacity, I was left speechless. A son's possessions naturally belong to his blood relatives, right? He even left us his will like this. She flaunted a will in front of me. However, hearing this, I burst out laughing, finding their foolishness hilarious. What's so funny? Jenny peeked from behind Greg, glaring at me displeased by my reaction. Wiping the tears from my laughter, I shared a shocking truth with the disgruntled relatives. Don't you know? This house is mine now. What? Huh? Confused by my words, his relatives looked dumbfounded. Their clueless faces made me want to laugh again. But I held back and went to get a document from another room. As you can see, the real owner of this house is me. Richard changed the ownership to me while he was still alive. thinking it would be more helpful for the future. What did you say? Hearing about the change of ownership, his mother widened her eyes in shock. She hurriedly snatched the document from me and examined it closely with Greg. It's really written here. The ownership is in this woman's name. The document was authentic, and the ownership was indeed in my name. Realizing the truth of my words, Greg and Jenny raised their voices. But I responded nonchalantly. You must be mistaken. The ownership was supposed to be in Richard's name, wasn't it? When he was discharged, he changed the ownership to me on his own volition. At that point, his mother interrupted, "That's not right," and thrust the will she had at me. It can't be. Because here, I have a will that he supposedly wrote. The paper she showed was indeed written in Richard's handwriting. However, it lacked any signature, rendering it non-functional as a will. Dismayed by their ignorance, I sighed deeply. But knowing they wouldn't listen to anything I said, I asked them to wait and made a phone call. Thank you for your help. I'm sorry to trouble you, but Richard's family has stormed in over the will. Could you please come over right away? Thank you. Who were you calling just now? Startled by my sudden phone call, Greg looked at me suspiciously. I didn't answer him in detail, but merely indicated for them to come inside. I seated his mother and Greg on the sofa and instructed the kids to play. Soon, the doorbell rang again, and I went to greet the caller, leading him directly into the living room. Sorry for the delay. A man in a suit entered, and Greg's group immediately became defensive, eyeing him with hostility. It's no trouble at all. Sorry for the sudden call. This is Mr. Anderson, a lawyer who has been helping us with Richard's affairs. I called him because your mother mentioned bringing a will. A lawyer? As soon as they realized Mr. Anderson was a lawyer, his mother exclaimed in shock. I had met Lawyer Anderson through a friend who had lent us the villa, and he had explained the situation to him. At first, Richard and I were anxious because Mr. Anderson was a young lawyer, just 30 years old. However, he was quick-witted and had a strong track record with family disputes, which reassured us after meeting him. We had entrusted him with all matters regarding the estate and the family dispute. His relatives had no idea Richard had hired a lawyer. Their faces showed surprise as if they had never heard such a thing. Greg and his family were also shocked and lost for words. Allow me to reintroduce myself. I'm Lawyer Anderson. I've come to discuss matters concerning Richard. We will be recording this conversation as it will serve as evidence. In contrast to Greg's flashy long hair, Lawyer Anderson had short hair and wore glasses to soften his sharp gaze, presenting a clean and professional appearance. Forgetting her place, his mother looked at Lawyer Anderson with admiration. Lawyer Anderson greeted, and the relatives, led by his gesture, also greeted and received his business card and lawyer badge. Seeing the badge, his mother straightened up. Greg and Jenny did the same, their demeanor tense. I sat down on the sofa with Lawyer Anderson, ready to face his relatives. Lawyer Anderson skillfully activated a voice recorder and started the discussion. Your mother has brought a will. May I take a look at it? Lawyer Anderson spoke calmly, perhaps too assertively, as his mother's hands trembled slightly with the will, likely overwhelmed by anxiety about not having such a backup, and possibly losing out on the inheritance. Facing a practicing lawyer, they couldn't just talk their way out of it, and their concern about an unfavorable turn of events was evident. Lawyer Anderson quietly reviewed the will handed to him by his mother. After reading it, He looked at me and nodded once. Thank you. I'll return this to you. Lawyer Anderson handed the will back to his mother with a forced smile. This seemed to fuel her anxiety further, prompting her to question the validity of the document. It was Richard's will, right? Yes, it appears to be Mr. Richard's will indeed. See? This means the house is ours now. His mother became confident upon hearing the affirmation of the will. However, Lawyer Anderson quickly dampened her expectations by adding, "It's an older version." What did you say? At the words issued from his mouth, my mother-in-law frowned and urged him to repeat himself, as if saying, "Say that again. Didn't you hear?" While it is indeed a will of Richard, it stated. The valid will, recognized officially, would be this one. Lawyer Anderson then pulled out a newer document from his bag. It read, "All my assets shall belong to Hillary. Any previous wills written to my mother are hereby invalidated. And this will shall stand effective." What? Let me see that. Jenny snatched the will from Lawyer Anderson to verify it. The document not only had a more recent date but also included Richard's signature. Clear proof of its authenticity, especially since it mentioned being drafted with legal assistance. As the reality dawned on Jenny and the others, their faces drained of color. And his mother began to tremble. So, this will is. Essentially, it's just a piece of useless paper. No way. At the mention of useless paper, Greg directed his anger toward his mother. Despite being in front of a lawyer, he lashed out at her rapidly. What the hell, old hag? You said the inheritance would be ours, just leave it to you. Greg was almost about to grab his mother as he hurled words at her. Jenny tried desperately to hold him back, but Greg, fueled by male aggression, shrugged her off and continued his verbal assault, his mother cowering in fear. In the midst of this chaos, I glared sternly at Greg and spoke calmly. Could you please refrain from causing a scene in someone else's home? It's extremely troublesome. What did you say? If you act out of line here, we can have Lawyer Anderson provide evidence and take this to court. Mentioning Lawyer Anderson seemed to bring Greg back to his senses. Remembering that the opponent was a lawyer, he hastily sat back down on the sofa. By the way, was that will really written by Richard's own volition? Seeing that things had settled, I directed a question at his mother. She seemed ready to affirm it was his handwriting, but I waited quietly for her response. Yes, he wrote it for me when he was hospitalized. Really? And he wrote it willingly, did he? Exactly, that's what your mother-in-law is saying. What's with all these questions? Jenny cut in, clearly frustrated by my interrogation style. His mother nodded in agreement, and seeing this, I exchanged a knowing glance with Lawyer Anderson. He adjusted his glasses and nodded back at me, giving the go-ahead. That's strange then. Because according to the hospital's security camera footage, you forced Richard to write that will. I pulled out a laptop from my bag, inserted a USB drive provided by the hospital, and started playing the video. When I had approached Lawyer Anderson about Richard's situation, Richard had informed him that he had been coerced into writing the will. I explained this to the hospital as well. The hospital, willing to cooperate fully, provided the surveillance camera footage. I immediately downloaded this data and displayed the recorded video on the screen. You wouldn't want to see your assets go to waste after you're gone, huh? His mother could be heard coercing Richard in the video, with Greg and Jenny also complicit in the act. If you don't want that woman to suffer, just keep quiet and write the will. Right, Richard. If you just quietly write this, no harm will come to that woman at all. This footage was taken 3 days before Richard's discharge. They had inquired about his cancer's progression specifically to hasten their plan for the inheritance. It's not like that. We were just joking around. Yeah? We watched a drama before going to the hospital. And the villain was so cool, I just tried to mimic him. It wasn't serious, can't you let it slide? As they realized their disadvantage, the three began to frantically defend themselves. But their excuses only fueled my anger, and I sighed in disgust at their pitiful display. Even if you admitted it honestly, trying to cover it up makes you a perpetrator. Mr. Anderson, can we apply charges of coercion against them? Of course, we have their statements recorded clearly. Lawyer Anderson picked up the voice recorder with a broad smile. Greg and the others paled, having forgotten about the recorder as they spoke. That's why we will be seeking damages for everything on behalf of that person. No. Wait, Hillary. It was only your mother-in-law who made him write it, we were just there. Jenny tried to deflect responsibility. But what followed was an ugly dispute between his mother and Greg. You were all complicit in forcing him to write that will. Mom said she could handle it well. We were just there, didn't do anything. But you were threatening Richard to write quickly. That was because his consultation time was nearing, not to force him to sign the will. If we dawdled, you might come, Hillary. Indeed, they had deliberately targeted the time I was away. Jenny made a statement that provided further evidence, but in their desperation to argue, they likely hadn't realized it. The three continued their ugly squabble, seemingly unable to stop. The children, who had been playing in the back, must have become concerned by the arguing because they all came over. Among them was a child as young as 2. I could see the anxiety in their eyes. I knew the children weren't at fault. So I quickly called over my eldest nephew. A 5th grader, told him to move to another room, and urged him not to watch the adults' disgraceful fighting. Unsure of what was happening, he did as told, taking his younger siblings with him. Once the children were out of sight, I coldly addressed the 3 adults. Aren't you embarrassed? You're still parents, right? What did you say? To argue in front of the children, blaming each other. I'm speechless at your shameful behavior. Don't you feel pathetic pushing responsibility onto others? Jenny seemed to snap out of it and glanced toward where the children had disappeared. Remembering their anxious exit, she came over to me and apologized. I'm sorry. I admit to everything, the threats and all past actions. Please, forgive us. Greg and his mother, too, hurriedly apologized, desperately trying to find a way out. We need to support those kids, so please, the money. If I'm hit with a compensation claim now, I don't know how I'll manage to live. Please, have mercy. If there's a crime, I'll atone for it. The 3 of them pleaded tearfully, but my anger exploded. In the end, it's all about your own lives, your money. There's no real remorse. But that's not. We don't mean it that way. It's just that life is tough. And we wanted you to understand our situation. You know what that is? It's called an excuse. Craig jerked as if stung by my words. Jenny and his mother probably felt the same. They scrambled to apologize, but I didn't let them get a word in and continued sharply. No matter how much you apologize, I have no intention of forgiving you. If you're really concerned about the children, then work harder and pay back what you owe. All this happened because you forced Richard to do those things. Why should I forgive you? That's absurd. The three found no words to counter mine. If you understand, then please leave. This house is a precious place filled with my memories, and I have no intention of sharing my life with you. Please, Hillary. Forgive us. We were wrong. Hillary, please. Their desperate pleas continued. But I coldly threatened to call the police if they spoke further. Realizing the seriousness of a police report, they quickly gathered their children and belongings and left my home. Lawyer Anderson and I watched with cold eyes as the dysfunctional family members exited. After making sure they had left, we immediately locked the door. Finally, it's over, I sighed in relief alongside Lawyer Anderson. I then asked Lawyer Anderson to proceed with the compensation claim process, which he had already prepared thoroughly. The claim was processed smoothly, and the three were billed a combined sum of $30,000 for coercing Richard into writing the will. They couldn't afford the large sum and proposed a settlement, but I refused to compromise. You'll pay in full. Because they couldn't negotiate, their lives changed drastically. The mother had to care for 6 children alone from morning till night. Greg and Jenny worked non-stop, living in poverty. They sold the mother's house and moved into a cramped apartment with 9 people. Although they managed to repay the compensation without fail, their life never regained comfort. And it seemed their hardship would continue until the youngest child became an adult. Thus, I successfully cut ties with them. Even after sorting through the possessions, I continued living in that house. I kept working, and occasionally my colleagues would visit, which helped alleviate any loneliness. Here's today's offering. I would say daily, joining my hands in prayer and telling Richard about my day. It was our last promise, after all. Even if I become frail and need hospitalization, I'll continue to pray for you every day. On that day, Richard had asked me for one last thing, to talk to him in front of his portrait daily. I love our talks and your voice. I want it to reach me even in heaven. With those words, Richard had passed away. I vowed to keep our promise until the day I would join him.